You're nothing but a business vulture, Lisa, circling around successful companies, looking for your next meal. Patricia Morrison's voice cut through the bustling trade show floor like a blade, her words delivered with the precision of someone who'd perfected the art of public humiliation. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood there in the very convention center I secretly owned, watching my husband's family tear apart everything I'd spent 6 years building with them. The industrial equipment displays around us seemed to hum with the energy of deals being made and fortunes being won, but all I could hear was the sound of my marriage cracking under the weight of their contempt. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never intended to become invisible in my own life. When I first walked into that networking event at the Denver Tech Center 6 years ago, I was Lisa Chen, senior financial analyst, with a corner office and a reputation for turning around struggling portfolios. I wore my MBA from CU Boulder like armor, carried business cards that meant something, and had just closed a deal that saved my firm's biggest client $2 million in unnecessary expenditures. I was somebody. I mattered. I had a voice that people listened to when I spoke about market trends and investment strategies. That night, I was attending the Colorado Business Leaders Mixer reluctantly, preferring to spend my Thursday evening reviewing quarterly reports rather than making small talk over overpriced wine and cheese cubes. My colleague Sarah Kim had practically dragged me there, insisting I needed to expand my network beyond spreadsheets and financial statements. The ballroom at the Westin downtown was filled with the usual suspects: entrepreneurs in expensive suits discussing their latest ventures, established business owners comparing revenue figures, and young professionals desperately trying to make connections that might advance their careers. I was standing near the back of the room, checking emails on my phone and calculating how long I needed to stay before politely excusing myself, when Mark Morrison approached me. He wasn't the most polished person in the room, didn't have the aggressive confidence that seemed to radiate from the tech startup founders clustered near the bar, but there was something genuine about the way he introduced himself that caught my attention. "I'm probably the only person here who actually needs help rather than trying to sell something," he said with a self-deprecating smile that reached his eyes. "Mark Morrison from Morrison Industries. We manufacture industrial equipment, and frankly, I'm in way over my head trying to find office space that won't bankrupt us." I found myself genuinely curious about his problem. Morrison Industries, he explained, had outgrown their original facility in Commerce City, but couldn't afford the premium rates that commercial real estate brokers were quoting for spaces in the tech corridor. His father Bob had built the company from a small operation in the 1980s into a regional player in construction and mining equipment, but growth had been organic and cash flow was always tight. They needed modern facilities to compete for larger contracts but couldn't justify the expense of prime real estate. "What's your current square footage and what are you actually paying per square foot?" I asked, my analytical mind automatically shifting into problem-solving mode. Mark's answers revealed immediately that he was being quoted rates 30% above market value, probably because the brokers had pegged Morrison Industries as an unsophisticated family business without proper representation. I spent the next hour walking Mark through the commercial real estate landscape in Denver, explaining how different neighborhoods commanded different rates, which areas were experiencing oversupply that created negotiating opportunities, and how timing lease renewals could save significant money. I pulled up comparables on my phone, showed him buildings that met their requirements for half the price he'd been quoted, and explained exactly how to structure negotiations to get the best terms. "I don't understand why you're helping me," Mark said as the evening wound down. "What's your angle here?" "No angle," I replied honestly. "I like solving problems. And yours has an obvious solution that nobody bothered to show you." That conversation led to coffee the following week, which led to me spending a Saturday morning touring potential facilities with Mark, which led to Morrison Industries securing a lease on a perfect warehouse and office complex in the River North Art District for 40% less than their original budget. Mark insisted on taking me to dinner to celebrate, and somewhere between the lease signing and dessert at that little Italian place in Lodo, we stopped talking about real estate and started talking about everything else. Mark was different from the men I usually dated. He wasn't trying to impress me with his success, or his connections, or his expensive watch. He talked about his family's business with genuine pride but also honest frustration about the challenges of working in a family company where tradition often trumped innovation. He asked thoughtful questions about my work, seemed genuinely interested in understanding how financial analysis differed from accounting, and never once made me feel like I needed to downplay my expertise to make him comfortable. My family thinks business is all about relationships and handshake deals, he told me over wine during our third dinner together. They don't understand that the world has changed. Dad still thinks having good instincts and treating people fairly is enough to compete with companies that have sophisticated analytics and strategic planning departments. I found myself wanting to help Morrison Industries succeed, not because I was interested in their business specifically, but because I could see how much it meant to Mark. He genuinely cared about the employees who'd been with the company for decades, worried about whether they were prepared for the industry consolidation that was clearly coming, and felt the weight of responsibility for preserving something his father had built from nothing. When we started dating seriously, Mark began asking for my opinion on business decisions. Morrison Industries was considering expanding into a new product line, and the financial projections they'd received from their accountant seemed overly optimistic. I spent a weekend reviewing their assumptions and discovered several critical errors in the cash flow analysis that would have led to disaster if they'd proceeded with the original plan. "You just saved us from making a $250,000 mistake," Mark said after I walked him through my revised projections. "How do I even begin to thank you for that?" "You don't need to thank me," I said. "I want you to succeed. When you succeed, I'm happy." That was the moment I realized I'd fallen in love not just with Mark, but with the vision of what we could build together. Morrison Industries had solid fundamentals but lacked the financial sophistication to compete at the next level. I had the analytical skills and business connections they needed, but I'd grown tired of helping anonymous corporate clients maximize profits for shareholders I'd never meet. Together, we could create something meaningful. Meeting the Morrison family, however, was like walking into a parallel universe where my professional accomplishments meant nothing and my ethnic background was a constant subject of barely concealed curiosity. The first family dinner at Bob and Patricia's house in Cherry Creek was a masterclass in polite hostility disguised as traditional hospitality. "So Lisa, Mark tells us you work in finance," Patricia said over salad, pronouncing finance as if it were slightly distasteful. "That must be interesting work for a woman." "I'm a senior analyst specializing in corporate restructuring and investment strategy," I replied, hoping to establish my credentials early. "How nice," Patricia continued smoothly. "And what does your family think about you working in such a demanding field? Are your parents supportive of your career choices?" The question was designed to probe whether my family had appropriate values about women's roles, and I could feel Mark tensing beside me as he recognized the subtle interrogation taking place. Bob Morrison dominated the conversation throughout dinner, regaling us with stories about the early days of Morrison Industries that I'd already heard from Mark but pretended to find fascinating. He was clearly proud of what he'd built, but his pride was tinged with defensiveness, as if he expected to be challenged on his methods or his success. "We've always been a family company," Bob explained, carving the roast beef with ceremonial precision. "We take care of our people, we keep our word, and we don't chase every trend that comes along. Some of these newfangled business consultants would have us computerizing everything and laying off half our workforce, but we know what works." Kevin Morrison, Mark's older brother and heir apparent to the company leadership, listened to his father with the reverent attention of someone auditioning for approval. At 38, Kevin had worked at Morrison Industries since college graduation, climbing through every department with the methodical thoroughness of someone who knew his destination was predetermined. He was competent but unimaginative, the kind of manager who executed other people's strategies without questioning whether they made sense. "Dad's right about staying true to our core values," Kevin said, glancing meaningfully at his wife Amanda, who nodded supportively. "There's something to be said for proven methods and institutional knowledge." Amanda Morrison was everything I wasn't. Tall, blonde, from an established Denver family that had made their money in oil and gas 3 generations ago. She'd married Kevin straight out of college, produced 2 beautiful children in quick succession, and devoted herself to charitable work and social climbing with equal enthusiasm. She spoke in the careful, measured tones of someone who'd been trained from birth to say the right thing at the right time to the right people. "Lisa, you must find Denver quite different from wherever you grew up," Amanda said, with the kind of smile that managed to be both warm and condescending simultaneously. I grew up in Aurora, I replied, so not that different. Oh, Amanda said, as if Aurora were a foreign country rather than a Denver suburb. How interesting. The subtext was clear. I was an outsider who needed to prove I belonged, and my professional success was less important than my social pedigree. Throughout that first dinner and many that followed, I found myself constantly defending choices I'd never had to justify before. My decision to keep my maiden name professionally, my long hours at work, my lack of interest in joining the country club, or participating in the charity committees that occupied Amanda's time. But Mark seemed genuinely proud of my accomplishments, often bringing up my successes in ways that I later realized were subtle attempts to gain his family's respect for my contributions. When Morrison Industries was struggling with cash flow issues due to delayed payments from a major client, Mark suggested that I review their accounts receivable management processes. Lisa helped us negotiate our office lease for 40% less than we were originally quoted, Mark told his father during a family barbecue. She has connections throughout the commercial real estate market and understands how to structure deals that actually work. Bob Morrison listened politely but dismissively, the way he might listen to a child explaining their school project. Real estate is all about relationships, son. You can't get good deals from spreadsheets. I bit my tongue and didn't mention that my spreadsheets had identified the specific buildings that were overpriced due to rookie mistakes by their listing agents, or that my analysis had. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Revealed market conditions that created negotiating leverage Morrison Industries could exploit. Instead, I focused on the potato salad and tried to ignore Patricia's pointed comments about how nice it must be for Mark to have someone who could help with the business side of things. The pattern became established early and persisted throughout our relationship. I would identify problems, propose solutions, and implement strategies that saved Morrison Industries significant money or created new opportunities, but my contributions were consistently minimized or attributed to other factors. When I restructured their equipment financing to reduce their monthly payments by 15%, Bob credited the bank's, quote, generous terms. When I negotiated supplier contracts that reduced their material costs by 8%, Kevin claimed credit for improved vendor relationships. The worst part wasn't the lack of recognition. I was accustomed to working behind the scenes and didn't need applause for doing my job effectively. The worst part was watching Mark struggle between loyalty to his family and appreciation for what I brought to the table. He would defend me privately, expressing frustration with his family's inability to recognize my value, but publicly he rarely challenged their dismissive attitudes directly. They just need time to get used to you, Mark would say after particularly uncomfortable family gatherings. You have to understand, they've never dealt with someone who has your level of expertise. It's intimidating for them. I wanted to believe that time and consistent results would eventually earn their respect, so I continued contributing to Morrison Industries' success while building my own career. The real estate investment firm I'd started with my former colleague Jennifer Walsh was thriving, allowing me to apply my analytical skills to property markets rather than corporate portfolios. We specialized in distressed commercial properties, identifying buildings that were undervalued due to temporary market conditions or management problems that could be solved with proper investment and oversight. Chen Walsh Properties started small, purchasing a neglected office building in the Highlands that we renovated and leased to small businesses at competitive rates. Our success with that first project led to bigger opportunities, and within 3 years we had assembled a portfolio worth over $80 million. I was proud of what Jennifer and I had built together, proud of the jobs we'd created, proud of the neighborhoods we'd helped revitalize. But at Morrison family gatherings, my business was treated as a hobby rather than a serious enterprise. Patricia would ask about my little real estate ventures with the same tone she might use to inquire about a book club or pottery class. Amanda would make comments about how nice it must be to have something to keep me busy while Mark was at work. Bob would nod politely when Mark mentioned our latest acquisition but never asked follow-up questions about our strategy or our results. The turning point came when Morrison Industries faced its biggest crisis in company history. A major client who represented 20% of their annual revenue declared bankruptcy unexpectedly, leaving Morrison Industries with unpaid invoices worth over $3 million. The loss threatened to trigger their own financial collapse, as their cash reserves were insufficient to cover operational expenses without that expected revenue. Bob Morrison called an emergency family meeting to discuss their options, and for the first time, Mark insisted that I be included in the conversation. "Lisa understands our financial situation better than anyone," Mark argued when his father initially resisted my involvement. "She's been helping us optimize our operations for 3 years. We need her expertise right now." The meeting took place on a Saturday morning in the conference room at Morrison Industries headquarters, a building I'd helped them lease and had visited countless times but where I'd never been invited to participate in strategic discussions. Bob Morrison sat at the head of the conference table looking every one of his 65 years, while Kevin and Amanda flanked him like advisors to a king. Patricia took notes in her careful handwriting, and Mark sat beside me, his jaw tight with tension. "The situation is simple," Bob began without preamble. "Dakota Construction owes us $3.2 million, and their bankruptcy filing means we'll be lucky to recover 30 cents on the dollar. We can't continue operations without that cash flow, and our credit line is already maxed out." Kevin had prepared a presentation outlining their options, all of which were variations on the same theme: massive layoffs, facility closures, and scaling back operations to survive until they could rebuild their client base. His analysis was competent but unimaginative, focused entirely on cost reduction rather than revenue generation or strategic alternatives. "We'll have to let go of about 60% of our workforce immediately," Kevin said, clicking through PowerPoint slides that reduced 3 decades of company building to bullet points and graphs. "We can consolidate operations into our original facility and focus on our core product lines until we stabilize." I listened to Kevin's presentation with growing frustration, recognizing immediately that he was proposing a managed decline rather than a recovery strategy. Morrison Industries had valuable assets, long-term contracts, and institutional knowledge that competitors would pay premium prices to acquire. Instead of shrinking the company into irrelevance, they could leverage their strengths to create new opportunities. "Kevin's numbers are accurate, but his assumptions are too conservative," I said when Bob asked for my opinion. "You're treating this like a permanent setback instead of a temporary cash flow problem." I had spent the previous evening analyzing Morrison Industries' financial statements and developing alternative scenarios based on my experience with corporate restructuring. The company's fundamental business was sound. They had valuable equipment, skilled employees, and solid relationships with suppliers. What they lacked was working capital to bridge the gap between Dakota Construction's bankruptcy and their next major contracts. "You have $3 million in inventory sitting in your warehouse right now," I continued, pulling out the analysis I'd prepared. "Your equipment is appraised at $12 million, much of it with substantial resale value. You have receivables from other clients worth another $2 million that could be factored if necessary. Instead of laying off employees, you should be looking at asset-based financing to maintain operations while you pursue new business." Bob Morrison listened with the polite attention he might give to a weather report, but I could see Kevin's defensive posture as I challenged his recommendations. Amanda took careful notes, probably planning to fact-check everything I said, while Patricia maintained the neutral expression she used when topics moved beyond her expertise. "Asset-based lending sounds complicated," Bob said finally. "We've always operated on a cash basis. Start borrowing against our equipment, and pretty soon the bank owns everything." "Not if you structure the financing correctly," I replied. "I have relationships with commercial lenders who specialize in manufacturing companies. They understand your industry and can offer terms that give you breathing room without putting your core assets at risk." Mark spoke up for the first time during the meeting. "Lisa saved us $250,000 when we were considering that product line expansion. Her financial analysis caught problems our accountant missed completely." "That's different," Kevin interjected quickly. "This is about the survival of the company. We need proven strategies, not experimental financing schemes." The word experimental hung in the air like an accusation. I realized that Kevin saw my suggestions not as expertise, but as threats to his vision of how Morrison Industries should be managed. To him, I was an outsider proposing changes that would diminish his authority and challenge the traditional methods that defined the company's culture. Asset-based financing isn't experimental, I said evenly. It's a standard tool for managing cash flow in manufacturing companies. I can have 3 different lenders compete for your business within a week. And what exactly do you get out of this? Amanda asked suddenly, her voice sharp with suspicion. I mean, you're proposing to spend a lot of time helping us arrange financing. What's your fee structure? The question revealed everything about how the Morrison family viewed my contributions to their business. In their minds, I was either incompetent, offering advice worth less than they were paying for it, or I had hidden motives that would eventually cost them money. The possibility that I might genuinely want Morrison Industries to succeed because Mark's happiness depended on it was apparently beyond their comprehension. I don't charge family, I said simply. But you're not family, Patricia said quietly, her words delivered with surgical precision. You're Mark's girlfriend who happens to work in finance. Mark's face flushed red. Lisa and I have been together for 4 years. We're talking about getting married. She is family. Talking about getting married isn't the same as being married, Bob said with finality. This is a family business, and family business decisions should be made by family. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized that 4 years of contributions, countless hours of unpaid analysis, and measurable improvements to Morrison Industries' operations had earned me exactly nothing in terms of respect or recognition. I was still an outsider whose expertise was tolerated but not valued, whose motives were suspect, and whose presence at strategic meetings was conditional on Mark's insistence rather than their appreciation. The meeting ended with Bob agreeing to consider my suggestions while proceeding with Kevin's downsizing plan. Over the following week, I contacted 3 commercial lenders and obtained preliminary financing proposals that would have solved Morrison Industries' cash flow problems without requiring layoffs or facility closures. The terms were favorable, the documentation was straightforward, and the lenders were prepared to close within 30 days. Bob Morrison thanked me politely for my efforts and then chose to implement Kevin's plan instead, laying off 43 employees and closing their secondary facility. When I asked Mark why his father had rejected financing options that would have saved jobs and preserved the company's growth trajectory, his answer revealed the fundamental disconnect between the Morrison family's values and business reality. Dad thinks borrowing against the equipment would compromise our independence, Mark explained. He built this company without owing money to banks, and he doesn't want to start now. But he's laying off people who've worked for him for 20 years, I replied. How is that preserving independence? Mark didn't have an answer, and I realized that Morrison Industries' problems weren't really financial. They were cultural. The family's commitment to traditional methods and suspicion of outside expertise had become more important than the company's success or their employees' welfare. That was when I began to understand that my relationship with the Morrison family would never be based on mutual respect or shared goals. I could contribute to their success indefinitely, but I would always be the outsider whose motives were questioned and whose expertise was minimized. Mark loved me, but his family would never accept me as anything more than a temporary presence in their son's life. I married Mark anyway, hoping that time and continued success would eventually change their perspective. The wedding was a study in polite warfare, with Patricia Morrison organizing an event that showcased her social connections while minimizing my family's presence. My parents, both immigrants who had built successful careers through hard work and education, were treated as honored guests but clearly viewed as curiosities by the Morrison social circle. It's so wonderful that Mark is marrying someone from such an interesting background, I overheard one of Patricia's friends say during the reception. It shows how open-minded the family has become. My maiden name became a particularly contentious issue when I decided to maintain it professionally while taking Morrison socially. Patricia treated this decision as a personal insult, while Bob viewed it as evidence that I wasn't fully committed to joining their family. The fact that Chen Walsh Properties was an established business with existing client relationships and legal obligations never seemed to register as a legitimate reason for maintaining professional continuity. Amanda took Kevin's name completely when they married, Patricia mentioned frequently in the months following our wedding. It's traditional for wives to demonstrate their commitment to their husband's family. Amanda herself became increasingly passive-aggressive in her interactions with me, particularly as Chen Walsh Properties continued to grow and attract attention in Denver's commercial real estate market. When we were featured in a Denver Business Journal article about successful women entrepreneurs, Amanda made sure to mention at the next family gathering that some people seem to prioritize career recognition over family obligations. The birth of Amanda and Kevin's third child provided another opportunity for subtle criticism of my choices. At 34, I was apparently reaching an age where my lack of children was becoming a legitimate subject for family discussion. "Lisa, you and Mark have been married for 2 years now," Patricia said during Easter dinner, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing other people's reproductive decisions. "Don't you think it's time to start thinking seriously about giving Mark children?" Mark intervened quickly, explaining that we were focused on establishing our careers and would start a family when we felt ready, but I could see the disappointment in his parents' faces. Another mark against the daughter-in-law who put business before family obligations. Chen Walsh Properties' success, rather than earning respect from the Morrison family, seemed to create additional suspicion about my priorities and motives. When we acquired the Westfield Convention Center through a bankruptcy auction in late 2021, Jennifer and I had achieved something that few real estate investment firms our size could match: ownership of a premier event venue that generated substantial revenue and served as the anchor for our entire portfolio. The convention center purchase was the culmination of everything I'd learned about distressed asset acquisition and commercial real estate investment. Westfield Hospitality Group had overextended themselves during the pandemic, defaulting on their mortgage and filing for bankruptcy protection. The property was appraised at $36 million, but market conditions and the complexity of convention center operations had discouraged most potential buyers. Jennifer and I spent 6 months analyzing the property's financial performance, studying the event industry's recovery projections, and developing a business plan that would restore the venue to profitability. We assembled a consortium of investors, including several of my former financial analysis clients who trusted my judgment, and we submitted a winning bid of $18 million, exactly half the property's appraised value. Taking ownership of the Westfield Convention Center was the proudest moment of my professional career. Jennifer and I had identified an opportunity that others missed, structured a complex acquisition that required sophisticated financial planning, and acquired an asset that immediately became the crown jewel of our portfolio. Within 6 months, we had restored the venue to full operations, attracting major events and conferences that generated substantial revenue for our investors. But when I mentioned the acquisition to Mark's family, their response was characteristically dismissive. "Convention centers seem like risky investments," Bob said when Mark shared news of our purchase. "Too dependent on economic conditions and travel patterns. Actually, event venues tend to be recession-resistant," I replied. "People still need spaces for conferences, trade shows, and corporate events, regardless of economic cycles." "If you say so," Patricia added with the tone she used when humoring children. "It sounds very complicated." I didn't bother explaining the market analysis that had identified the convention center as an undervalued asset, or the revenue projections that justified our purchase price, or the operational improvements we'd implemented to maximize profitability. The Morrison family had already decided that my business success was either lucky or irrelevant, and additional details wouldn't change their perspective. Mark continued working in Morrison Industries' marketing department, but our conversations about his family's business became increasingly strained. I could see him struggling between frustration with their resistance to change and loyalty to the company his father had built. Morrison Industries had recovered from their cash flow crisis, but remained vulnerable to industry consolidation and technological disruption that Bob and Kevin refused to acknowledge. "They need to invest in new equipment and expand their service offerings," Mark said one evening as we reviewed Morrison Industries' quarterly results. "Our competitors are offering integrated solutions while we're still selling individual components." "Have you suggested developing a strategic plan for expansion?" I asked. "Kevin thinks strategic planning is just fancy talk for spending money we don't have," Mark replied. "Dad agrees with him. They think if the company survived the Dakota construction bankruptcy, it can survive anything. I wanted to point out that survival and growth were different objectives, that Morrison Industries was losing market share to competitors who understood modern business practices, but I'd learned to keep my observations to myself unless specifically asked for advice. Mark's family had made it clear that my expertise was unwelcome, and my continued attempts to help were interpreted as evidence of ulterior motives, rather than genuine concern for their success. The irony was becoming impossible to ignore. Chen Walsh Properties was thriving precisely because Jennifer and I applied the same analytical rigor and strategic thinking that Morrison Industries rejected. We identified undervalued properties through careful market analysis, structured acquisitions that maximized returns while minimizing risk, and managed our assets with professional oversight that produced consistent results. Our success proved that modern business methods worked when properly implemented, but the Morrison family remained convinced that traditional approaches were superior to systematic analysis. As our 4th wedding anniversary approached, I realized that my relationship with Mark's family had calcified into a pattern of polite hostility that would never change. I would always be the outsider whose success threatened their worldview, whose expertise challenged their methods, and whose presence reminded them that their son had chosen someone they didn't approve of. Mark loved me and valued my contributions, but he lacked the strength to demand that his family treat me with respect. The annual Rocky Mountain Industrial Equipment Expo was approaching, Morrison Industries' biggest sales opportunity of the year, and the event that would determine whether they could compete effectively with larger, more sophisticated competitors. For the past 3 years, I'd watched from the sidelines as Morrison Industries struggled with trade show marketing, losing potential clients to companies that understood how to present themselves professionally in competitive environments. This year, Mark asked if I would help them prepare for the expo, acknowledging that their previous approaches had produced disappointing results. "We need to do something different," Mark admitted. "Kevin's been managing our trade show presence, but we're not getting the kind of leads we need to grow the business." I agreed to help, spending weeks developing a comprehensive marketing strategy that would position Morrison Industries as a premium provider rather than a low-cost alternative. I designed display materials that showcased their capabilities, created presentations that highlighted their competitive advantages, and developed lead generation systems that would capture potential clients' information for systematic follow-up. The irony was perfect in its completeness. I was preparing Morrison Industries for success at an event held in the convention center I secretly owned, working to help the family that dismissed me as a business vulture succeed in a venue where I controlled every aspect of their experience. They had no idea that their daughter-in-law owned the building where their future would be determined, that the complicated investment they'd dismissed as risky was generating the revenue that made their event possible. But as I finalized Morrison Industries' trade show materials and confirmed their booth specifications with Carlos Mendoza, the event coordinator I'd helped during his family crisis, I began to wonder whether this might be the perfect opportunity to finally show the Morrison family exactly who they'd been underestimating for 6 years. The shift in family dynamics became impossible to ignore during the Morrison Industries board meeting that I wasn't invited to attend. Mark came home that Tuesday evening with the defeated expression of someone who'd watched a train wreck in slow motion, loosening his tie as he collapsed onto our kitchen bar stool. "They're making Amanda the official trade show coordinator," he said without preamble. "Kevin convinced Dad that we need someone with better social connections to represent the company at industry events." I paused in the middle of chopping vegetables for dinner, the knife suspended above the cutting board as I processed what Mark had just told me. For 3 weeks, I'd been developing Morrison Industries' trade show strategy, creating marketing materials that positioned them as industry leaders rather than regional suppliers, designing booth layouts that would maximize traffic flow and lead generation. I'd spent countless hours researching their competitors' presentations, analyzing successful trade show campaigns, and developing systems that would actually produce measurable results. "What about all the work we've been doing on the expo preparation?" I asked, setting down the knife and turning to face him. "The display materials? The lead tracking system? The presentation slides we've been refining?" Mark ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd learned to recognize as his way of processing family politics that made no logical sense. "Amanda wants to review everything and make her own modifications. She thinks our approach is too technical, not personal enough." Amanda Morrison had never worked in industrial equipment sales. had never attended a trade show as anything other than a spouse accompanying her husband, and had never demonstrated any understanding of Morrison Industries' business beyond knowing that it paid for her lifestyle in Cherry Creek. But she possessed something that apparently mattered more than expertise. She was blonde, polished, and came from a family that belonged to the right country clubs. Did you explain to them that trade show success is measured in qualified leads and conversion rates, not how charming the booth staff appears? I asked, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. I tried, Mark said, opening a beer with more force than necessary. Kevin said that industry relationships are built on trust and personal connections, not PowerPoint presentations and spreadsheets. Dad agreed that Amanda's family background gives her credibility with the kind of clients we want to attract, the kind of clients they wanted to attract. The phrase revealed everything about how the Morrison family viewed their business development strategy. They weren't interested in growing their market share through superior products or competitive pricing. They wanted to attract clients who would value them based on social pedigree rather than industrial capability. Mark, Morrison Industries manufactures construction equipment, I said, sitting down across from him at our kitchen island. Your clients are project managers and procurement specialists who care about specifications, delivery schedules, and warranty terms. They're not choosing vendors based on whether the sales team belongs to the Denver Country Club. I know that, Mark replied, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd had this argument before. But Kevin thinks we've been focusing too much on technical details and not enough on relationship building. He says successful companies in our industry succeed because of who they know, not what they know. I wanted to point out that Kevin's relationship-building approach had produced exactly one major new client in the past 2 years, while my analysis of their sales data revealed that their most profitable contracts came from clients who'd chosen Morrison Industries based on competitive bidding rather than personal connections. But I'd learned that challenging Kevin's business philosophy was interpreted as challenging the family's core values. Instead, I focused on the practical implications of Amanda's appointment as trade show coordinator. Has Amanda ever managed a trade show booth before? Does she understand lead qualification processes or conversion tracking? She'll learn, Mark said with a shrug that suggested he knew exactly how inadequate that answer was. Kevin thinks her natural people skills will be more valuable than technical expertise. The conversation died there, but the implications lingered throughout the following week, as Amanda began implementing her vision for Morrison Industries' trade show presence. She scheduled a family meeting to review my materials, which had apparently been deemed too sophisticated for their target audience. The meeting took place on Saturday morning in the Morrison Industries conference room, the same space where I'd presented financing alternatives during their cash flow crisis. Amanda had arranged the materials I'd created across the conference table like evidence in a trial, each poster board and presentation slide positioned for maximum scrutiny. Lisa's work is very thorough, Amanda began with the kind of diplomatic tone that signals incoming criticism. But I think we need to consider whether this approach really reflects Morrison Industries' brand personality. She gestured toward the display boards I'd designed, which featured clean graphics showcasing Morrison Industries' equipment capabilities alongside customer testimonials and performance statistics. The materials were professional without being flashy, informative without being overwhelming, designed to attract serious buyers rather than casual browsers. These displays look like something a Fortune 500 company would use, Amanda continued, her criticism disguised as observation. But Morrison Industries is a family business with a personal touch. Shouldn't our trade show presence reflect that intimacy? Patricia Morrison nodded approvingly from her seat beside Bob, clearly delighted that someone was finally questioning my contributions to the family business. Amanda has such a good eye for these things. She organized the most beautiful charity auction last month. Bob Morrison studied my materials with the expression of someone examining artifacts from an alien civilization. These are certainly impressive, but Amanda has a point about brand consistency. We want people to know they're dealing with a family company, not some corporate conglomerate. Kevin leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone whose strategic instincts were being validated by family consensus. The whole point of trade shows is relationship building. People buy from people they trust, and trust comes from personal connections, not fancy graphics. I listened to their critique with growing disbelief, recognizing that they were rejecting materials designed to generate actual business in favor of an approach that prioritized social comfort over commercial effectiveness. My displays included specific product information, competitive advantages, and clear calls to action that would help qualified prospects move through their decision-making process. Amanda apparently preferred an approach that emphasized Morrison Industries' family heritage over their industrial capabilities. What changes are you thinking about making? I asked Amanda directly, genuinely curious about how she planned to improve materials that were based on proven trade show marketing principles. Amanda's smile brightened as she produced a folder containing her alternative vision for Morrison Industries' trade show presence. Her designs featured family photographs, historical timelines of company milestones, and testimonials from long-term employees rather than customers. The overall effect was more reminiscent of a family reunion display than a commercial sales presentation. I want people to understand that Morrison Industries is built on relationships that span generations, Amanda explained, spreading her materials across the table. When clients see that Bob started this company with his own hands, that Kevin grew up learning the business from the ground up, that we treat our employees like family members, they'll understand that we're not just another vendor. We're partners who care about their success. Her approach wasn't necessarily wrong for certain types of businesses, but it completely misunderstood Morrison Industries' competitive environment. The Rocky Mountain Industrial Equipment Expo attracted procurement professionals who were responsible for making purchasing decisions worth millions of dollars. These weren't people who would be swayed by heartwarming stories about family business values. They needed technical specifications, delivery guarantees, and pricing structures that justified their vendor selections to their own management teams. Amanda, that's a beautiful presentation of Morrison Industries' history, I said carefully. But trade show attendees are usually looking for specific solutions to immediate problems. They need to understand how your equipment will help them complete their projects more efficiently or cost-effectively. But anyone can provide technical specifications, Amanda replied with the confidence of someone who'd never actually had to sell industrial equipment. What differentiates Morrison Industries is our commitment to personal service and long-term relationships. Mark attempted to bridge our different approaches by suggesting that we could incorporate elements of both strategies. But Amanda's response made clear that she viewed this as a zero-sum competition rather than a collaborative effort. I appreciate all the work Lisa has put into this project, Amanda said with the kind of gracious dismissal that somehow managed to be more insulting than direct criticism. But I think Morrison Industries needs a fresh perspective from someone who really understands our brand identity. The phrase, really understands our brand identity, was delivered with surgical precision, implying that my 4 years of contributing to Morrison Industries' success had somehow failed to provide me with authentic insight into their business. The fact that I'd helped them navigate their worst financial crisis, negotiate better supplier contracts, and optimize their operational efficiency apparently didn't qualify me to understand their marketing needs. Patricia Morrison seized the opportunity to reinforce Amanda's authority over the trade show project. Amanda has such wonderful instincts about people and presentation. Remember how beautifully she handled the vendor reception last year? The vendor reception had been a cocktail party for Morrison Industries suppliers, an event that required exactly zero understanding of sales strategy or customer acquisition. But in the Morrison family's worldview, social event planning and trade show marketing were apparently equivalent skill sets. Bob Morrison delivered the final verdict with the kind of paternal authority that brooked no further discussion. Amanda will take the lead on trade show coordination. We appreciate Lisa's input, but this is a family business decision. I felt the familiar cold sensation that accompanied Morrison family meetings, where my contributions were acknowledged and then dismissed. 3 weeks of strategic planning, market research, and materials development had been reduced to, quote, input that could be safely ignored in favor of Amanda's social networking approach. Mark attempted to salvage something from the wreckage of our preparation work. We should at least keep some of Lisa's technical materials as backup displays. The product specification sheets and competitive analysis could be useful for serious prospects. We'll see what space is available after Amanda finalizes the booth design, Kevin said, with the kind of non-committal response that clearly meant no. The most important thing is presenting a cohesive brand message. The meeting ended with Amanda being granted complete authority over Morrison Industries' trade show presence, while my materials were relegated to reference documents that might or might not be used depending on space constraints. I gathered my displays and presentation materials with the resigned efficiency of someone who'd learned not to expect different outcomes from family business politics. Mark walked me to my car afterward, his expression apologetic but helpless. "I'm sorry about how that went. I know how much work you put into those materials." "It's fine," I replied, though we both knew it wasn't. "Amanda wants to take a different approach, and it's their company." "You could still help with the technical aspects," Mark suggested. "Maybe work with Amanda to make sure she has the product information she needs." I considered explaining that Amanda's approach would likely result in Morrison Industries being perceived as a quaint family operation rather than a serious industrial supplier, that trade show success required systematic lead generation rather than storytelling about company heritage. Instead, I focused on loading my materials into the trunk and avoiding further discussion about marketing strategies that would never be implemented. The following week provided additional evidence that my role in Morrison Industries was shifting from contributor to spectator. Amanda scheduled multiple meetings with the family to discuss trade show logistics, none of which included me despite my extensive experience with event planning through Chen Walsh Properties. When Mark mentioned that I'd managed vendor coordination for several conventions at the Westfield Convention Center, Amanda's response revealed the underlying dynamic that was driving my exclusion. "I'm sure Lisa is very capable," Amanda said with the patronizing tone she'd perfected for discussing my professional accomplishments. "But this is really a family project. We need to maintain control over how Morrison Industries is represented." The phrase "maintain control" was particularly revealing, suggesting that my involvement represented some kind of threat to their authority rather than an asset they could leverage for better results. Amanda apparently viewed trade show coordination as an opportunity to demonstrate her value to the Morrison family business, rather than an opportunity to generate revenue and attract new clients. Patricia Morrison reinforced Amanda's territorial claims during our next family dinner, praising her daughter-in-law's dedication to preparing for the expo while pointedly ignoring my previous contributions to the project. "Amanda has been working so hard on the trade show preparations," Patricia announced over dessert. "She's been meeting with vendors, coordinating graphics, managing all the logistics that go into representing Morrison Industries professionally." "Lisa designed most of the original graphics," Mark interjected, attempting to ensure that my work received appropriate recognition. "Yes, and they were very helpful as starting points," Amanda replied smoothly. "But we needed materials that really captured Morrison Industries' personality, not just generic marketing designs." The characterization of my materials as generic marketing designs was particularly galling, given that I'd spent weeks researching Morrison Industries' competitive landscape and developing messaging that positioned them as premium providers in their market segment. But Amanda's version of events was already becoming accepted family history, with my contributions being reframed as preliminary work that required her expertise to become truly effective. Kevin supported his wife's narrative with enthusiasm that bordered on zealotry. "Amanda understands that trade shows are about building relationships, not just displaying products. She's focused on creating an experience that makes people want to do business with Morrison Industries." I wondered what kind of experience Amanda was planning to create with family photographs and employee testimonials, but I'd learned that questioning family members' strategic insights was interpreted as personal criticism rather than professional discussion. The week before the Rocky Mountain Industrial Equipment Expo brought a flurry of final preparations that highlighted my complete exclusion from Morrison Industries' most important annual marketing event. Amanda had transformed their booth design into something that resembled a family history museum more than a commercial sales presentation, with prominence given to storytelling about company heritage rather than product capabilities or competitive advantages. Mark brought home photographs of their booth materials during the final setup week, showing me displays that featured Bob Morrison's origin story, family milestones, and testimonials from employees who'd worked at the company for decades. The materials were professionally produced and undeniably attractive, but they seem designed to generate nostalgia rather than purchase orders. What do you think? Mark asked as I reviewed Amanda's handiwork spread across our dining room table. It tells a compelling story about Morrison Industries' history, I replied carefully, trying to find diplomatic ways to express my concerns about their commercial effectiveness. But? Mark prompted, recognizing that my diplomatic response contained unspoken reservations. Trade show attendees usually have limited time and specific purchasing objectives, I said finally. They might appreciate learning about Morrison Industries' heritage, but they probably need product information and technical specifications to justify vendor selection decisions. Mark nodded thoughtfully, then gathered the materials with the resigned efficiency of someone who understood the problem but lacked authority to implement solutions. Amanda thinks the technical details can be covered in follow-up conversations with qualified prospects. The assumption that Morrison Industries would generate qualified prospects through heritage storytelling seemed optimistic, but I'd learned not to voice skepticism about family business strategies that had already been implemented. Instead, I focused on preparing for my own attendance at the expo, planning to observe Morrison Industries' performance while managing Chen Walsh Properties' interests at the event. My decision to attend the trade show had been complicated by the Morrison family's assumption that I would be working in their booth as unpaid support staff. Amanda had mentioned during dinner the previous week that she'd love to have Lisa's help managing their displays, apparently viewing me as available labor rather than an independent professional with my own business interests at the event. I'll be attending the expo, but I have meetings scheduled with Chen Walsh Properties clients, I explained to Mark when he relayed Amanda's expectations. We're considering several properties in the convention district, and the trade show provides a good opportunity to assess market demand. Mark seemed relieved that I'd found a legitimate reason to maintain distance from Morrison Industries' booth, probably recognizing that family dynamics would be strained enough without adding the complexity of my presence in a subordinate role. The morning of the expo opening brought Denver's typical October weather, crisp autumn air that made the walk from our house in Highland to the Westfield Convention Center particularly pleasant. I'd chosen professional attire that would be appropriate for business meetings but wouldn't compete with Amanda's carefully planned booth coordinator outfit, settling on a navy suit that projected competence without drawing attention. Walking into the convention center that I secretly owned provided a surreal satisfaction that I couldn't share with anyone. The bustling energy of trade show setup, vendors arranging displays and testing equipment, attendees picking up registration materials and reviewing floor plans, all of this activity was happening in a building that Jennifer and I had rescued from bankruptcy and restored to profitability. Carlos Mendoza was managing the vendor coordination with his characteristic efficiency, checking booth assignments, and resolving setup conflicts with the patient professionalism that had made him invaluable to our event operations. He recognized me immediately, greeting me with the warmth reserved for property owners who took personal interest in operational excellence. Ms. Chen, good morning, Carlos said, consulting his tablet for updates on the morning's setup progress. Everything is proceeding smoothly. Morrison Industries completed their booth installation yesterday afternoon, and they seemed very pleased with their space allocation. I felt a private amusement at the irony that Morrison Industries was pleased with space allocation decisions that I'd ultimately approved through Chen Walsh Properties' ownership structure. They had no idea that their booth location had been specifically selected to maximize foot traffic and visibility, or that their rental rates were subsidized by building ownership that prioritized long-term relationships over short-term profits. How did the displays look? I asked Carlos, genuinely curious about Amanda's final presentation choices. Very professional, Carlos replied diplomatically. Different from some of the more technical exhibitions, but definitely eye-catching. They seemed to be emphasizing company history and employee relationships. Carlos's diplomatic description confirmed my suspicions about Amanda's approach, but I appreciated his professionalism in avoiding direct criticism of exhibitor strategies. The success or failure of Morrison Industries' trade show presence would speak for itself over the following 3 days. I spent the morning touring the exhibition floor and attending opening ceremonies, taking note of how different companies were positioning themselves and what approaches seemed to be generating the most visitor engagement. The most successful booths combined attractive displays with knowledgeable staff who could answer technical questions and provide specific solutions to customer problems. Morrison Industries' booth stood out for exactly the reasons I'd feared it would. Amanda had created a beautiful presentation of the company's heritage and values, but it felt more like a corporate history exhibit than a sales environment. Visitors would pause to read the family story and examine vintage photographs, but few seemed to be engaging in serious conversations about purchasing decisions. Amanda herself was managing the booth with the social skills she'd perfected at charity events, greeting visitors with warmth and enthusiasm while steering conversations toward Morrison Industries' family business values rather than their product capabilities. She looked elegant and professional, and visitors clearly enjoyed talking with her, but I noticed that most interactions ended with polite exchanges of business cards rather than substantive discussions about project requirements or equipment specifications. Bob Morrison worked the booth with the pride of someone showing off a Morrison Industries interests. The possibility that I might be attending for legitimate real estate business reasons apparently hadn't occurred to them. Or perhaps they simply couldn't imagine me having professional obligations that didn't revolve around their family company. Chen Walsh Properties is evaluating expansion opportunities in the convention district, I replied honestly. Trade shows provide good insight into market demand and space utilization patterns. Patricia's expression sharpened with the kind of focused attention she reserved for topics that might affect her family's interests. What kind of expansion opportunities? Additional event venues, possibly hotel or office properties that could serve the convention market, I said, keeping my explanation general without mentioning that we already owned the building where Morrison Industries was currently exhibiting. Bob Morrison seemed satisfied with my explanation, but Patricia continued studying me with the analytical intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. It seems like a lot of work for one trade show, Patricia observed. Wouldn't it be more efficient to review market data from multiple events over several years? Her question revealed a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of commercial real estate analysis, and I wondered whether Patricia Morrison was more astute about business strategy than she typically led on during family discussions. Trade shows provide qualitative insights that complement quantitative data, I replied. Seeing how exhibitors use space and interact with customers helps inform property development decisions. Our conversation was interrupted by Amanda's arrival, her face flushed with excitement and exhaustion from managing booth operations throughout the morning. "Lisa, I'm so glad you're here," Amanda said with enthusiasm that seemed genuine despite our recent tensions over trade show coordination. "You should see how well our booth is performing. We've had constant traffic all morning, and people are really responding to our family business story." "That's wonderful," I replied sincerely. "You've clearly put a lot of work into creating an engaging presentation." Amanda beamed at the praise, apparently interpreting my diplomatic response as validation of her marketing strategy. I knew that focusing on relationships rather than just technical specifications would differentiate Morrison Industries from the competition. Patricia and Bob exchanged satisfied glances, clearly pleased that Amanda's approach was producing the positive reception they'd hoped for. Their confidence in family business instincts over professional marketing expertise seemed to be justified by the morning's results. "We should probably get back to the booth," Bob said, checking his watch and noting that the lunch break was ending. "This afternoon should be even busier than the morning." As the Morrison family headed back to their exhibit space, I remained near the Industrial Solutions Northwest booth, continuing to observe trade show dynamics, while processing the conversation I'd just had. Patricia Morrison's questions about Chen Walsh Properties' expansion plans had been more probing than I'd expected, suggesting that she might be more aware of my business activities than she typically led on during family gatherings. The afternoon sessions provided additional evidence that Morrison Industries was succeeding at generating positive impressions without capturing serious business opportunities. Their booth remained busy throughout the day, with visitors clearly enjoying conversations with Amanda and Bob about company heritage and family business values. But as I watched their interactions more closely, I noticed that most conversations followed the same pattern: initial interest in Morrison Industries' story, polite exchanges about company history and employee loyalty, business card exchanges, and promises to, quote, stay in touch that rarely included specific follow-up commitments or purchasing timelines. Their competitors, meanwhile, were conducting systematic lead qualification conversations that identified, specific project requirements, budget parameters, and decision-making timelines. Companies like Rocky Mountain Equipment were scheduling follow-up appointments, collecting detailed contact information, and documenting prospect needs in ways that would support systematic sales processes. By late afternoon, I'd gathered enough information about convention district market demand to justify my presence at the expo, and I was preparing to leave when I encountered Kevin Morrison near the registration area. "Lisa, perfect timing," Kevin said with the kind of forced enthusiasm that suggested he'd been looking for me. "Amanda wanted me to invite you to join us for the closing reception this evening. She thinks it would be good to have your perspective on how the day went." The invitation was clearly Amanda's attempt to be gracious despite our disagreements about trade show strategy. But I suspected that my perspective would be welcomed only if it validated their family business approach. "That's very thoughtful," I replied, "but I have dinner plans with clients who are considering properties in the area." Kevin's expression suggested that he found my excuse convenient rather than legitimate, but he didn't challenge my explanation directly. "Maybe tomorrow then. Amanda would love to get your input on how we can build on today's success." "I'll see what my schedule allows," I said diplomatically, knowing that my input would be unwelcome if it included suggestions about systematic lead qualification or technical product presentations. As I left the Westfield Convention Center that evening, I reflected on the strange irony of spending a day observing my husband's family business operate in a building that I secretly owned. Morrison Industries had achieved exactly what they'd hoped for: positive visitor reactions, engaging conversations about company heritage, and validation of their family business values. But I'd also observed what they'd failed to achieve: systematic lead generation, technical product discussions, or measurable progress toward actual sales. Their success was social rather than commercial, and I wondered whether that distinction would matter when they evaluated the expo's return on investment. More troubling was the growing sense that my attendance at the trade show had been viewed with suspicion by Patricia Morrison, whose questions about Chen Walsh Properties suggested a level of scrutiny that made me uncomfortable. I'd been careful to avoid any appearance of competing with Morrison Industries or undermining their efforts, but Patricia seemed to view my very presence as somehow threatening to their interests. The following morning brought news that would transform the Morrison family's expo experience from social success to public humiliation, though none of us knew it yet as we prepared for the second day of the Rocky Mountain Industrial Equipment Expo. The second day of the Rocky Mountain Industrial Equipment Expo began with the kind of crisp October morning that made Denver feel like the center of the universe. I arrived at the Westfield Convention Center early, ostensibly to meet with potential property investors, but primarily to observe Morrison Industries' continued performance before the day's crowds arrived. The exhibitor floor had a different energy during setup hours, vendors making final adjustments to displays, testing equipment, and preparing for what they hoped would be their most productive day of the year. Morrison Industries' booth looked exactly as it had the previous afternoon: Amanda's heritage-focused displays, arranged with the precision of someone who understood visual presentation, even if she misunderstood commercial objectives. Bob Morrison was already there, adjusting family photographs and reviewing the employee testimonials that served as centerpieces for their marketing strategy. His pride in the company's history was evident in every gesture, every careful positioning of materials that told the story he wanted visitors to understand. Amanda arrived shortly after me, carrying coffee and pastries from the convention center's cafe, her energy levels suggesting that yesterday's positive reception had validated her confidence in relationship-based marketing. She greeted the setup crew with the kind of warm efficiency that made people want to work harder, and I had to admit that her people skills were genuinely impressive even if they were being applied to the wrong objectives. Kevin appeared next, reviewing his handwritten notes from yesterday's conversations and planning his networking strategy for the day ahead. He carried himself with the satisfaction of someone whose social instincts were being proven correct by measurable results, though I noticed that his measurable results consisted primarily of business cards collected rather than qualified prospects identified. Mark was the last family member to arrive, and his expression suggested that he'd spent the morning wrestling with concerns that he couldn't articulate to his family. He caught my eye across the exhibit floor and offered a slight smile that seemed to convey both greeting and apology, though I wasn't sure what he felt he needed to apologize for. I was reviewing space utilization patterns near the main entrance when Patricia Morrison appeared beside me with the sudden precision of someone who'd been planning this encounter. "Lisa, I'm glad I found you," Patricia said with the kind of focused attention that suggested our conversation would be more substantive than casual pleasantries. "I wanted to ask you about something that's been bothering me since yesterday." Her directness was uncharacteristic, and I felt my attention sharpen as I prepared for whatever concern had motivated her to seek me out before the exhibition floor officially opened. "Of course," I replied. "What's on your mind?" Patricia glanced around the nearly empty exhibition space, apparently ensuring that our conversation wouldn't be overheard by early arriving attendees or vendor staff making final preparations. "You mentioned yesterday that Chen Walsh Properties is evaluating expansion opportunities in the convention district," Patricia said, her tone carefully neutral. "I've been thinking about that, and I'm wondering exactly what kind of expansion you're considering." Her question carried implications that went beyond casual curiosity, and I realized that Patricia Morrison might have been conducting her own research into my business activities. The thought that she'd been investigating Chen Walsh Properties created a cold sensation in my stomach, though I couldn't immediately identify what she might have discovered or why it would concern her. "We're always looking for undervalued properties that could benefit from our development expertise," I replied honestly, keeping my explanation general without revealing specific acquisition targets or ownership structures. "But surely you're not considering competing directly with existing convention facilities?" Patricia continued, her voice carrying the kind of pointed concern that suggested she'd identified a specific threat to Morrison Industries' interests. The implication that Chen Walsh Properties might be planning to compete with the Westfield Convention Center was both ironic and revealing. Patricia apparently saw my presence at the expo as evidence of business plans that could somehow disadvantage Morrison Industries, when in reality my ownership of the venue was creating advantages they didn't even know they were receiving. "Patricia, Chen Walsh Properties focuses on distressed commercial real estate," I said carefully. "We're not in the convention center development business." "Then why are you spending so much time studying how other companies operate their trade show presentations?" Patricia asked, her suspicion now evident despite her attempts to maintain diplomatic tone. "Yesterday you seemed more interested in our competitors' booths than in supporting Morrison Industries' success." Her accusation revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had been growing between us since I'd married into the Morrison family. Patricia apparently viewed my professional activities as potential threats to their business interests, rather than legitimate independent enterprises. The possibility that I might have expertise worth leveraging for Morrison Industries' benefit seemed less important to her than ensuring that I didn't pose competitive challenges. "I was observing different marketing approaches because trade show strategy is relevant to commercial real estate analysis," I explained, though I suspected that no explanation would satisfy Patricia's concerns about my motives. "Understanding how companies use exhibition space helps inform property development decisions." Patricia's expression suggested that she remained unconvinced by my explanation, but our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of David Chen, a client I'd been expecting to meet regarding potential hotel development opportunities in the convention district. "Miss Chen Morrison, perfect timing," David said as he approached us near the main entrance. "I've reviewed the market analysis you provided, and I'm very interested in discussing the property acquisition opportunities you've identified." David's greeting inadvertently revealed more about my business activities than I had intended to share with Patricia Morrison, who was clearly listening to our exchange with sharp attention. His reference to market analysis and property acquisition opportunities would undoubtedly fuel her suspicions about Chen Walsh Properties' expansion plans. "David, good morning," I replied, accepting his handshake while noting Patricia's increased attention to our conversation. "I have the additional documentation you requested. Should we find somewhere quiet to review the details?" "Actually, I'd love to tour the convention center facilities first," David said, consulting his phone for the agenda we'd discussed the previous week. "Understanding how the building operates during major events would help inform our hotel development strategy." His request for a facilities tour created an immediate problem, since conducting such a tour would require revealing my relationship with Carlos Mendoza and potentially exposing my ownership interest in the building. Patricia Morrison was still standing beside us, clearly monitoring our conversation for information about Chen Walsh Properties' business plans. I can arrange for someone from the facilities management team to provide that tour, I said carefully, hoping to deflect David's request without arousing additional suspicion from Patricia. Perfect, David replied enthusiastically. I'm particularly interested in understanding traffic flow patterns and space utilization efficiency. Your analysis suggested that convention center operations could inform optimal hotel location decisions. Patricia's expression sharpened at David's reference to my analysis of convention center operations, and I realized that his comments were creating exactly the kind of scrutiny I'd hoped to avoid. Well, I should let you two get to your business meeting, Patricia said with the kind of polite dismissal that clearly meant she'd gathered the information she'd been seeking. It sounds like Chen Walsh Properties has some very interesting projects in development. As Patricia walked away, I felt the uncomfortable certainty that she would be sharing details of our conversation with the rest of the Morrison family, probably with interpretations that cast my business activities in the most threatening possible light. David seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of my exchange with Patricia, focusing instead on his excitement about potential hotel development opportunities in the convention district. Your market analysis was incredibly thorough, David continued as we walked toward the administrative offices where I could arrange his requested facilities tour. The data about convention attendance patterns and visitor spending habits suggests there's significant demand for premium hotel accommodations in this area. I nodded absently, my attention divided between David's enthusiasm and concerns about how Patricia Morrison would interpret his comments about my market analysis and property acquisition activities. Let me introduce you to Carlos Mendoza, our facilities coordinator, I said as we approached the administrative suite. He can provide the operational insights you're looking for. Carlos was reviewing vendor schedules when we entered his office, and his face brightened with recognition when he saw me accompanied by a potential client. Ms. Chen, good morning, Carlos said, rising to shake hands with both of us. How can I help you today? Carlos, this is David Chen from Mountain West Development, I said, using the introduction to establish context for David's business interests. He's considering hotel development opportunities in the convention district and would appreciate a tour of the facilities to understand operational patterns. Carlos immediately shifted into professional tour guide mode, clearly pleased to showcase the convention center's capabilities to a potential partner in the hospitality industry. Absolutely, Mr. Chen, Carlos said, gathering his keys and radio equipment. I'd be happy to show you how we manage event logistics and visitor flow. Understanding our operations will definitely inform your hotel planning decisions. As Carlos led David away for their facilities tour, I remained in the administrative area to review some property management documents that required my attention as building owner. The paperwork was routine, mostly vendor contracts and maintenance schedules, but handling these ownership responsibilities while maintaining my cover as a commercial real estate analyst created constant tension. I was reviewing utility bills when Jennifer Walsh called with updates about another property acquisition we were considering. Lisa, I just heard back from the bank about the warehouse financing, Jennifer said without preamble. They're willing to approve the loan, but they want additional collateral beyond the Westfield Convention Center. Her casual reference to the convention center as collateral for other investments would have been devastating if overheard by anyone connected to Morrison Industries, and I was grateful that I'd taken the call in a private office rather than the exhibition floor. Can we discuss this later? I said quietly. I'm at a client event right now. Of course, Jennifer replied, apparently recognizing from my tone that the timing was inappropriate for detailed business discussions. Call me when you're free. The bank needs our response by Friday. As I ended the call and prepared to return to the exhibition floor, I reflected on the increasingly complex balancing act required to maintain my various professional relationships, without revealing information that could compromise Chen Walsh Properties' competitive advantages or create additional family tensions. The exhibition floor had filled with attendees during my absence, and Morrison Industries' booth was experiencing the same positive traffic they'd enjoyed the previous day. Amanda was in her element, engaging visitors with stories about company heritage while Bob Morrison provided historical context that visitors seemed to find genuinely interesting. But I also noticed that their competitors were converting visitor interest into business opportunities more systematically than Morrison Industries. Rocky Mountain Equipment had scheduled 3 follow-up appointments during the morning session alone, while Industrial Solutions Northwest was collecting detailed project specifications from qualified prospects. Morrison Industries was generating goodwill without capturing business intelligence, creating positive impressions without advancing commercial objectives. Their success was social rather than strategic, and I wondered whether that distinction would matter when they evaluated the expo's return on investment. I was observing these dynamics from a respectful distance when I encountered Dr. Sarah Kim, my former colleague from Colorado Investment Group, who was attending the expo as part of her current firm's expansion into industrial real estate financing. "Lisa, what a surprise," Sarah said with genuine pleasure. "I didn't expect to see you at an industrial equipment trade show." Chen Walsh Properties is evaluating commercial real estate opportunities in the convention district, I explained, grateful to have a conversation with someone who understood my business activities without requiring detailed explanations. "That makes sense," Sarah replied. "Your analytical skills would definitely transfer to commercial property evaluation. How's the real estate business treating you?" "Very well," I said, enjoying the opportunity to discuss my professional success with someone who appreciated the expertise required for successful property development. "We've assembled a strong portfolio over the past few years." Sarah's expression brightened with professional interest. "I'd love to hear more about your strategy. Are you focusing on specific property types or geographic areas?" Our conversation continued pleasantly as we walked through the exhibition floor, Sarah asking thoughtful questions about commercial real estate trends, while I enjoyed discussing my business with someone who understood the complexity of property acquisition and development. We were near the Morrison Industries booth when Patricia Morrison appeared beside us with the determined expression of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this opportunity. "Lisa, I see you're networking with other finance professionals," Patricia said with the kind of pointed observation that carried implications beyond casual comment. "Patricia, this is Dr. Sarah Kim from Rocky Mountain Capital," I said, hoping to redirect the conversation toward normal professional introductions. "Sarah, this is Patricia Morrison from Morrison Industries." Sarah extended her hand politely, clearly unaware of the family dynamics that made this introduction more complicated than it appeared. "Nice to meet you," Sarah said pleasantly. "Lisa and I worked together at Colorado Investment Group before she started her real estate firm." Patricia's attention sharpened at Sarah's reference to my previous career in investment analysis, and I realized that she was gathering additional information about my professional background for purposes I couldn't immediately identify. "How interesting," Patricia said with the kind of focused curiosity that suggested she would remember every detail of this conversation. "Lisa hasn't mentioned working in investment analysis. She was one of our best analysts," Sarah continued, apparently interpreting Patricia's interest as genuine rather than investigative. "Lisa had a talent for identifying undervalued assets and developing strategies that other analysts missed." Sarah's praise was gratifying, but I noticed that Patricia Morrison was processing this information with the kind of analytical attention she usually reserved for potential threats to her family's interests. "What kind of assets did Lisa specialize in analyzing?" Patricia asked, her question delivered with casual curiosity that didn't fool me for a moment. "Corporate restructuring mostly," Sarah replied. "Lisa could identify companies that were fundamentally sound but temporarily distressed due to management problems or market conditions. She had a gift for seeing potential where others saw only problems." Patricia nodded thoughtfully, clearly filing this information away for future reference. Her questions about my investment analysis background were creating exactly the kind of scrutiny I'd hoped to avoid, particularly given that my expertise in distressed asset acquisition had led directly to Chen Walsh Properties' ownership of the Westfield Convention Center. Our conversation was interrupted by commotion from the Morrison Industries booth, where a group of potential clients was asking technical questions that Amanda couldn't answer comprehensively. Bob Morrison was attempting to provide product specifications, but his explanations lacked the precision that serious buyers typically required. "I should probably help them," I said, recognizing an opportunity to escape Patricia's interrogation while providing assistance that Morrison Industries clearly needed. "Of course," Sarah said understandingly. "It was wonderful seeing you again, Lisa. Let's have lunch soon to catch up properly." As Sarah walked away, Patricia remained beside me, watching the activity at Morrison Industries' booth, with an expression that suggested she was formulating conclusions about my relationship to their business success. "Lisa?" Patricia said quietly, her voice carrying a tone I'd never heard from her before. I think we need to have a serious conversation about your intentions regarding Morrison Industries. Her statement was delivered with such gravity that I felt my attention focus entirely on whatever accusation she was preparing to make. I'm not sure what you mean, I replied carefully. Patricia glanced around the busy exhibition floor, apparently ensuring that our conversation wouldn't be overheard by other attendees or Morrison Industries family members. You've been studying our competitors, analyzing trade show operations, networking with finance professionals who specialize in corporate acquisitions, Patricia said, her voice low but firm. It's starting to look like you're gathering intelligence for some kind of business purpose that you haven't shared with the family. Her accusation was both completely wrong and dangerously close to the truth. I wasn't gathering intelligence to compete with Morrison Industries, but I was concealing business activities that could significantly impact their operations if revealed inappropriately. Patricia, Chen Properties is a real estate investment firm, I said as calmly as possible. Our business interests don't overlap with Morrison Industries' manufacturing operations, but your investment background does give you expertise in identifying acquisition targets and restructuring opportunities, Patricia replied, clearly drawing on information from her conversation with Sarah Kim. Companies like Morrison Industries could be attractive investments for someone with your analytical skills. The irony of Patricia's suspicions was almost overwhelming. She was essentially accusing me of planning to acquire Morrison Industries when I'd already spent 6 years contributing to their success without receiving appropriate recognition or compensation. Her concern about hostile takeover attempts was misplaced, but her underlying fear about my hidden business activities was unfortunately justified. I have no interest in acquiring Morrison Industries, I said honestly, though I realized that my denial wouldn't address Patricia's broader concerns about my concealed professional activities. Maybe not Morrison Industries specifically, Patricia continued, her tone suggesting that she'd thought carefully about whatever accusation she was building toward. But you clearly have business interests that you're not sharing with the family, and those interests seem to be related to industrial companies and convention facilities. Her observation was uncomfortably accurate, and I realized that Patricia Morrison was more perceptive about business strategy than I'd given her credit for. She'd connected my presence at the trade show, my conversations with finance professionals, and my interest in convention center operations into a pattern that suggested hidden motives. Before I could respond to Patricia's concerns, Bob Morrison approached us with the satisfied expression of someone whose morning had exceeded expectations. "Ladies, good morning," Bob said cheerfully. "Patricia, you should see how well our booth is performing today. Amanda's relationship-focused approach is really resonating with visitors." Patricia's expression shifted immediately, from interrogation mode to supportive family member, though I noticed that she continued to monitor my reactions to Bob's enthusiasm about Morrison Industries' trade show success. "That's wonderful, Bob," Patricia replied warmly. "I was just talking with Lisa about how impressed we've all been with the Expo's organization and facilities." Her diplomatic redirection of our conversation was skillfully executed. But I remained uncomfortable with the realization that Patricia Morrison was conducting some kind of investigation into my business activities. Bob turned his attention to me with the kind of polite interest he typically showed when family obligations required him to engage with my professional opinions. "Lisa, as someone with experience in commercial properties, what do you think of the Westfield Convention Center's operations?" Bob asked. "From a business perspective, does this facility seem well managed?" His question was innocuous enough, but answering it required me to conceal my ownership interest, while providing observations that might reveal more about my knowledge of convention center operations than would be appropriate for a casual observer. "The facility seems very professionally managed," I replied carefully. "The staff is clearly experienced, and the logistics coordination appears quite sophisticated." "It's certainly a beautiful building," Bob continued. "I wonder what kind of investment it represents for the ownership group. Convention centers must require substantial capital investment." Patricia's attention sharpened at Bob's question about investment requirements, and I realized that their inquiry about the convention center's financial structure was probably connected to her concerns about my hidden business interests. "Commercial real estate investments vary significantly depending on acquisition circumstances and operational strategies," I said, keeping my response general without revealing specific knowledge about Westfield Convention Center's financial performance. "But surely someone with your background could estimate the kind of returns that convention center ownership might generate," Patricia pressed, her question clearly designed to test my knowledge of the specific property we were discussing. I was formulating a response that would deflect their inquiry without arousing additional suspicion when Kevin Morrison joined our conversation with news that would change everything. "Dad, we have a problem," Kevin said, his voice tight with concern. "I just talked to the facilities coordinator about scheduling our breakdown tomorrow, and he mentioned that there might be some issues with our vendor contracts." Bob's expression shifted immediately from casual conversation to business crisis mode. "What kind of issues?" "Something about compliance with building policies and insurance requirements," Kevin replied, consulting his phone for notes he'd apparently taken during his conversation with Carlos Mendoza. "The coordinator wants to meet with us this afternoon to review our documentation." Patricia and Bob exchanged glances that suggested they were as confused as Kevin about what compliance issues might affect their trade show participation. "That seems unusual," Bob said thoughtfully. "We've participated in this expo for 5 years without any problems with building policies or insurance requirements." "Maybe it's just routine verification," I suggested, hoping to diffuse their concern while buying time to understand what Carlos had discovered about Morrison Industries' vendor arrangements. "The coordinator seemed pretty serious about it," Kevin continued. "He said that all exhibitors need to demonstrate compliance with updated safety and insurance standards, and that companies without proper documentation might need to modify their displays or reduce their booth activities." Bob Morrison's face flushed with the kind of anger that typically preceded his most unreasonable business decisions. This is exactly the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that makes it impossible for family businesses to compete effectively. "We've been operating safely for decades without needing permission from building coordinators." His reaction revealed the fundamental disconnect between Morrison Industries' traditional business practices and modern commercial facility requirements. But it also created an opportunity for me to demonstrate my value to the family, while potentially addressing whatever compliance issues Carlos had identified. "I could review your vendor documentation if that would be helpful," I offered, recognizing that my expertise in commercial real estate operations might be relevant to resolving their compliance concerns. "That's very thoughtful," Patricia said with a tone that suggested she found my offer suspiciously convenient. "Though I have to wonder how you would know about building compliance requirements for trade show exhibitors." Her question carried implications that went beyond casual curiosity, and I realized that Patricia Morrison was beginning to suspect connections between my business activities and the convention center operations that I couldn't safely acknowledge. Before I could respond to Patricia's implied accusation, Amanda Morrison appeared at our group with the kind of urgent energy that suggested something significant had happened at their booth. "We need to talk," Amanda said to Bob and Kevin, her voice carrying undertones of excitement and concern. "I just had a very interesting conversation with someone from the building management company." Bob's attention focused immediately on Amanda's announcement. "What kind of conversation?" "Apparently there are questions about our exhibitor agreements and whether our booth setup complies with current building safety standards," Amanda said, her words creating exactly the kind of crisis atmosphere that Patricia Morrison would inevitably connect to my presence at the expo. Kevin frowned at Amanda's report. "That's what the facilities coordinator mentioned to me. What did the building management representative tell you specifically?" "She said that all exhibitors need to demonstrate compliance with updated insurance and safety requirements," Amanda replied, consulting her phone for details she'd apparently recorded during the conversation. "Companies that can't provide proper documentation might have to shut down their displays until they can resolve the compliance issues." The implications of Amanda's report were immediately clear to everyone in our group. Morrison Industries had invested significant money and preparation time in their trade show presence, and any disruption to their booth operations would be both financially and professionally devastating. But what wasn't clear to the Morrison family was that the compliance review Amanda described was likely connected to my ownership of the building and Carlos Mendoza's professional obligations to ensure that all exhibitors met current safety and insurance standards. Patricia Morrison's expression suggested that she was beginning to connect my business expertise, my presence at the expo, and the sudden emergence of compliance issues into a pattern that confirmed her suspicions about my hidden motives. "Lisa," Patricia said with the kind of focused intensity that indicated she'd reached definitive conclusions about my role in Morrison Industries' current crisis. Given your experience with commercial real estate operations, do you have any insight into what might be driving these compliance reviews? Her question was delivered as an accusation disguised as a request for professional opinion, and I realized that Patricia Morrison had concluded that I was somehow responsible for the problems that were threatening to shut down Morrison Industries' trade show participation. The truth was that I had no knowledge of the specific compliance issues Carlos had identified, but my ownership of the building and my relationship with the facilities management team created obvious conflicts of interest that I couldn't reveal without destroying my marriage and my relationship with Mark's family. Building compliance requirements change frequently, I said carefully, trying to provide helpful information without revealing my insider knowledge of Westfield Convention Center operations. Most facilities update their standards annually to address new safety regulations or insurance requirements. But surely these updates would be communicated to exhibitors well in advance of major events, Bob Morrison said, with the kind of reasonable expectation that suggested he didn't understand how commercial facility management actually worked. Not necessarily, I replied honestly. Compliance reviews often happen during events when building managers can observe actual operations and identify potential safety issues. Patricia's eyes narrowed as she processed my explanation of compliance review procedures, clearly noting that my knowledge of building management practices seemed more detailed than would be appropriate for someone with casual commercial real estate experience. You seem very familiar with convention center operations, Patricia observed, her tone suggesting that she'd identified another piece of evidence supporting her growing suspicions about my business activities. Before I could respond to Patricia's increasingly pointed questions about my knowledge of building operations, Mark Morrison appeared at our group with the harried expression of someone dealing with multiple crises simultaneously. "We have serious problems," Mark announced without preamble. "The facilities coordinator wants to meet with all family members in 30 minutes to review our compliance documentation, and apparently there are questions about our insurance coverage and vendor agreements that could shut down our entire booth." His report created immediate alarm among the Morrison family members, who clearly understood that losing their trade show presence would be commercially devastating and professionally embarrassing. "What specific compliance issues are they concerned about?" Bob asked, his voice tight with the kind of controlled anger that suggested he was preparing to fight whatever bureaucratic obstacles were threatening his company's success. "Insurance coverage limits, vendor agreement terms, something about fire safety compliance for our display materials," Mark replied, reading from notes he'd taken during his conversation with building management. "The coordinator said that several exhibitors are being reviewed, but we need to demonstrate compliance immediately or risk having our booth shut down." Amanda's face went pale as she processed the implications of Mark's report. "Shut down our booth? We've spent months preparing for this expo. Half our annual sales come from leads generated at this event. Which is exactly why we're going to fight these compliance requirements," Bob Morrison said with the kind of determination that typically preceded his worst business decisions. "Morrison Industries has been participating in trade shows for decades without needing permission from building coordinators to sell industrial equipment." Patricia Morrison remained focused on me throughout the family's discussion of their compliance crisis, her expression suggesting that she'd concluded I was somehow responsible for the problems threatening Morrison Industries' trade show success. "Lisa," Patricia said with barely concealed hostility, "since you seem to understand building compliance procedures so well, perhaps you could explain why these issues are suddenly emerging after 5 years of successful participation in this event." Her accusation was delivered as a question, but the implications were clear. Patricia Morrison believed that I had somehow orchestrated the compliance review that was threatening to destroy Morrison Industries' most important annual marketing event. The irony was both perfect and terrible. Patricia was essentially accusing me of sabotaging the family business that I'd spent 6 years trying to help succeed, using my ownership of the building where they were exhibiting to create problems that would damage their commercial reputation and financial performance. What Patricia didn't understand was that Carlos Mendoza's compliance review was probably motivated by professional obligations rather than personal vendettas, and that my relationship with the facilities management team was based on legitimate business ownership rather than competitive manipulation. But explaining these distinctions would require revealing my ownership of the Westfield Convention Center, which would create family conflicts that could destroy my marriage, while confirming Patricia's suspicions about my hidden business activities. As the Morrison family prepared to attend their mandatory meeting with Carlos Mendoza to address compliance issues that could shut down their trade show presence, I realized that 6 years of contributing to their success without receiving appropriate recognition had brought me to a moment where I would finally have the opportunity to show them exactly who they'd been underestimating. The meeting with building management would reveal whether Morrison Industries could demonstrate compliance with safety and insurance requirements that Carlos Mendoza was professionally obligated to enforce, regardless of his personal relationship with me or my ownership of the building. But it would also provide the Morrison family with their first indication that the daughter-in-law they'd dismissed as a business vulture actually controlled the venue where their commercial future was being determined. The conference room where Carlos Mendoza had arranged to meet with Morrison Industries was located on the second floor of the Westfield Convention Center, overlooking the exhibition floor where hundreds of vendors were conducting the business that justified the building's existence. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the Morrison Industries booth, with its heritage-focused displays and family photographs, looking suddenly small and vulnerable from this elevated perspective. Carlos had assembled a comprehensive collection of documents on the conference table, files that I recognized as standard building compliance records, but which would appear mysterious and threatening to the Morrison family. His expression was professionally neutral, the same careful composure he maintained when dealing with difficult exhibitors or complex logistical challenges. Bob Morrison entered the conference room with the defensive posture of someone preparing to fight bureaucratic obstacles, followed by Kevin and Amanda, who both looked nervous about challenges they didn't understand. Mark brought up the rear, his face reflecting the strain of being caught between loyalty to his family and growing suspicions about compliance issues that seemed to have emerged from nowhere. Patricia Morrison was the last to arrive, her attention immediately focusing on my presence in the conference room with an intensity that suggested she'd expected to find me there. "Mr. Morrison, thank you for coming," Carlos said, rising to shake hands with each family member while maintaining the courteous professionalism that made him so effective at managing difficult situations. "I'm Carlos Mendoza, Senior Event Coordinator for Westfield Convention Center." Bob Morrison accepted the handshake with grudging civility, clearly viewing this meeting as an unwelcome interruption to their trade show activities. "Mr. Mendoza, I hope we can resolve whatever compliance concerns you have quickly. Morrison Industries has been participating in industrial trade shows for decades without encountering these kinds of problems." "I understand your frustration," Carlos replied diplomatically, "but building safety requirements have evolved significantly over the past few years. We're required to ensure that all exhibitors meet current standards for insurance coverage, fire safety, and structural integrity." Carlos opened the first file on the conference table, revealing documentation that I knew related to Morrison Industries' exhibitor agreement and insurance certificates. His movements were methodical and professional, the approach of someone who understood that compliance enforcement required careful documentation rather than arbitrary authority. "Let's start with your insurance coverage," Carlos continued, extracting certificates that Morrison Industries had provided during their booth registration process. "Your general liability policy shows coverage limits of $2 million, which met our requirements when you registered 6 months ago." Bob Morrison's expression relaxed slightly at Carlos's acknowledgement that their insurance had been previously approved, but I could see from Carlos's careful phrasing that the conversation was heading toward more complicated territory. "However," Carlos continued, "our insurance requirements were updated last month to reflect changes in industry standards and liability exposure. Current policy requires general liability coverage of $5 million for exhibitors displaying industrial equipment weighing more than 10,000 pounds. Kevin Morrison leaned forward with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was beginning to understand the scope of their compliance problem. "What's the total weight of our display equipment?" Carlos consulted another document, his finger tracing specifications that Morrison Industries had provided during booth setup. "According to your equipment manifest, you're displaying approximately 15,000 pounds of industrial machinery, which places you in the category requiring enhanced insurance coverage." Amanda Morrison's face went pale as she processed the implications of Carlos's explanation. Are you saying that our insurance coverage is insufficient for our current display? Under current building standards, yes, Carlos replied matter-of-factly. Exhibitors with inadequate insurance coverage are required to either upgrade their policies immediately or reduce their displays to comply with existing coverage limits. Bob Morrison's complexion shifted through several shades of red as he absorbed Carlos's explanation of insurance requirements that could force Morrison Industries to dismantle the trade show presence they'd spent months developing. This is exactly the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that's destroying American business, Bob said, his voice rising with the kind of anger that typically preceded his most unreasonable demands. Morrison Industries has been operating safely for 30 years without anyone questioning our insurance coverage. I understand your frustration, Mr. Morrison, Carlos replied calmly, but these requirements are established by our insurance carriers and state regulatory agencies, not by building management. We don't have discretion to waive compliance standards. Patricia Morrison had been listening to the insurance discussion with growing suspicion, her attention periodically shifting to me as if she were trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. Mr. Mendoza, Patricia said, her voice carrying the kind of pointed inquiry that suggested she'd reached conclusions about the situation. These updated insurance requirements seem to have been implemented very recently. Is it standard practice to change exhibitor requirements during active events? Carlos paused before responding, clearly recognizing that Patricia's question was more sophisticated than Bob's emotional protests about bureaucratic obstacles. Building compliance standards are reviewed continuously, Carlos said carefully, but specific enforcement actions are typically triggered by operational observations or safety concerns identified during events. Patricia's expression sharpened at Carlos's explanation, and I realized that she was beginning to understand that Morrison Industries' compliance review had been motivated by specific concerns rather than routine policy enforcement. What operational observations triggered our compliance review? Patricia asked, her tone suggesting that she suspected deliberate targeting rather than random enforcement. Carlos opened another file, revealing photographs and inspection notes that documented specific safety concerns identified during Morrison Industries' booth setup and operation. Our safety inspection identified several issues with your display configuration, Carlos explained, spreading the photographs across the conference table. Your industrial equipment is positioned too close to emergency exit pathways. Your electrical connections don't meet current fire safety standards. And your booth materials include fabric displays that haven't been treated with required flame retardants. The photographs Carlos presented showed clear violations of building safety codes, documentation that would be impossible for Morrison Industries to dispute or dismiss as bureaucratic overreach. Kevin Morrison studied the safety photographs with growing concern, clearly recognizing that their booth setup had created legitimate compliance problems rather than arbitrary regulatory obstacles. These safety issues seem pretty serious, Kevin admitted, his tone suggesting that he was beginning to accept the legitimacy of Carlos's enforcement actions. What would we need to do to bring our display into compliance? Option 1 is to relocate your equipment to positions that don't block emergency exits, upgrade your electrical connections to meet current fire safety standards, and replace your fabric displays with flame-retardant materials, Carlos replied, consulting a checklist that detailed the modifications required for compliance. Bob Morrison's face darkened as he processed the scope of changes that would be required to address the safety violations Carlos had identified. Option 2, Carlos continued, is to reduce your display to equipment and materials that comply with your current insurance coverage and safety certifications. Amanda Morrison looked stricken as she realized that both compliance options would require significant modifications to the trade show presence she'd spent weeks developing. How long would we have to make these modifications? Amanda asked, her voice tight with concern about the commercial implications of disrupting their booth operations. Building policy requires compliance within 24 hours of notification, Carlos replied. Exhibitors who can't demonstrate compliance within that timeframe are required to cease booth operations until violations are resolved. The prospect of shutting down their booth during the most important day of the trade show created immediate panic among the Morrison family members, who clearly understood that losing their exhibition presence would be both financially and professionally devastating. "This is completely unreasonable," Bob Morrison declared, his voice loud enough to attract attention from people passing in the hallway outside the conference room. "Morrison Industries has been a reliable participant in this expo for 5 years. We shouldn't be subjected to harassment by building management over technicalities." Carlos maintained his professional composure despite Bob Morrison's increasingly hostile tone, but I could see the tension in his shoulders as he prepared to enforce compliance requirements against people who were challenging his authority. "Mr. Morrison, these aren't technicalities," Carlos said firmly. "Fire safety and emergency exit access are fundamental building code requirements that we're legally obligated to enforce." Patricia Morrison had been studying the safety photographs with the kind of analytical attention that suggested she was looking for evidence to support her growing suspicions about the timing and targeting of Morrison Industries' compliance review. "Mr. Mendoza," Patricia said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting answers to difficult questions. "You mentioned that compliance enforcement is typically triggered by operational observations. Who specifically observed the safety violations that led to our review?" Her question created immediate tension in the conference room, as Carlos clearly recognized that identifying the source of safety concerns could create additional complications for Morrison Industries' family dynamics. "Building safety inspections are conducted by multiple staff members throughout major events," Carlos replied diplomatically. "Safety violations are documented whenever they're observed, regardless of who identifies them." Patricia's expression suggested that she found Carlos's explanation unsatisfactory, and I realized that she suspected deliberate reporting of Morrison Industries' safety violations by someone with access to building operations. "But surely there are records of who submitted the specific reports that triggered our compliance review," Patricia pressed, her persistence suggesting that she believed identifying the source of safety concerns would reveal information about motivations behind the enforcement action. Carlos glanced briefly in my direction before responding, a momentary eye contact that Patricia Morrison noticed immediately. "Safety reporting is treated as confidential personnel information," Carlos said, attempting to deflect Patricia's inquiry without directly lying about his knowledge of who had identified Morrison Industries' compliance problems. But Patricia's sharp attention had caught Carlos's involuntary glance toward me, and I watched her expression shift as she began connecting my presence at the compliance meeting with my apparent familiarity with building operations. "Lisa," Patricia said, her voice carrying the kind of focused intensity that indicated she'd reached definitive conclusions about my role in Morrison Industries' current crisis. "You seem remarkably well informed about building compliance procedures for someone who's supposedly here as a commercial real estate observer." Her accusation was delivered as a statement rather than a question, and I realized that Patricia Morrison had concluded that I was somehow responsible for the safety violations that were threatening to destroy Morrison Industries' trade show presence. Mark Morrison looked confused by his mother's sudden focus on my involvement in their compliance problems. "Mom, Lisa isn't connected to building management. She's here for Chen Walsh Properties business." "Is she?" Patricia replied, her tone suggesting that she'd uncovered information that contradicted Mark's understanding of my activities. "Because it's starting to seem like Lisa knows quite a lot about convention center operations for someone who's just evaluating real estate opportunities." Bob Morrison's attention shifted to me with the kind of suspicious scrutiny that suggested he was beginning to share Patricia's concerns about my hidden involvement in their compliance crisis. "Lisa, do you know something about these safety violations that you haven't shared with the family?" Bob asked, his voice carrying implications that went far beyond casual inquiry. The moment had arrived when I could no longer maintain the pretense that my presence at the expo was coincidental, or that my knowledge of building operations was casual. Patricia Morrison's investigation had revealed connections that I couldn't explain without acknowledging my ownership of the Westfield Convention Center. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about my relationship to this building," I said carefully, recognizing that any explanation I provided would fundamentally change my relationship with Mark's family. Patricia's expression showed grim satisfaction at my admission that I'd been concealing information about my connection to the convention center operations. "What kind of relationship?" Patricia demanded, her voice sharp with the authority of someone who'd been proven correct about suspicions that others had dismissed. Before I could formulate a response that might minimize the family conflicts that were about to explode, Carlos Mendoza intervened with information that would make concealment impossible. Perhaps this would be a good time to clarify the ownership structure of Westfield Convention Center, Carlos said, apparently deciding that continued deception would create more problems than honest disclosure. Bob Morrison's attention focused entirely on Carlos's statement about ownership structure, clearly recognizing that this information was relevant to understanding Morrison Industries' compliance situation. "What about the ownership structure?" Bob asked. Carlos opened another file on the conference table, revealing documentation that I recognized as property ownership records that would identify Chen Walsh Properties as the current owner of Westfield Convention Center. "The building is owned by Chen Walsh Properties, LLC, Carlos said matter-of-factly, a commercial real estate investment firm based here in Denver. The conference room fell silent as the Morrison family processed Carlos's revelation about the convention center's ownership, each of them clearly struggling to protect occupants, not to create leverage for property owners. But the Morrison family was no longer interested in hearing explanations about legitimate safety enforcement, having concluded that my ownership of the building meant that any compliance problems they faced were evidence of deliberate manipulation rather than actual violations. Patricia Morrison delivered the accusation that would define how the family viewed my 6 years of marriage to Mark and contribution to their business success. "You're nothing but a business vulture, Lisa, circling around successful companies looking for your next meal," Patricia said, her voice carrying the kind of cold fury that made her words feel like physical blows. "You married into our family to get close to Morrison Industries, bought this building to control our business opportunities, and now you're using compliance enforcement to punish us for not giving you the recognition you think you deserve." Her characterization of my actions as predatory manipulation rather than legitimate business success was devastating in its completeness, transforming 6 years of genuine contribution and concealed property ownership into evidence of calculated deception and hostile intent. The phrase business vulture echoed in the conference room with the finality of a verdict, reducing my professional accomplishments and hidden assets to the level of opportunistic scavenging rather than strategic investment and competent management. Mark Morrison looked stricken as he processed his mother's accusation against his wife, clearly struggling to reconcile Patricia's hostile interpretation with his understanding of my character and motivations. "Mom, that's not fair," Mark said weakly, but his defense lacked conviction and I could see doubt creeping into his expression as he tried to understand why I'd concealed my ownership of the building where his family was exhibiting. Amanda Morrison seized the opportunity to reinforce Patricia's accusations while positioning herself as the victim of my alleged manipulation. "I can't believe I've been working in a building owned by someone who's been undermining our trade show preparations," Amanda said, her voice trembling with humiliation and anger. "No wonder our booth has been having problems. Lisa has been sabotaging us from the beginning." Her claim that I'd been sabotaging Morrison Industries' trade show preparations was demonstrably false, since their problems stemmed from Amanda's rejection of my marketing expertise and their failure to meet legitimate safety requirements. But emotional family dynamics rarely respond to factual corrections, and I realized that defending myself would only reinforce their perception that I was manipulative and deceptive. Bob Morrison's anger had reached the point where rational discussion was impossible, his face red with fury as he struggled to process the revelation that his family's commercial success had been dependent on facilities owned by the daughter-in-law he'd consistently dismissed and undervalued. 30 years I've been building Morrison Industries into a respected company," Bob said, his voice shaking with rage. "And now I find out that our biggest marketing opportunity of the year is controlled by someone who's been playing games with our business success." Carlos Mendoza attempted to restore focus to the actual compliance issues that Morrison Industries needed to address, regardless of family dynamics or ownership revelations. "Mr. Morrison, we still need to resolve the safety violations that were identified during inspection," Carlos said firmly. "The compliance deadline hasn't changed, and your booth operations remain suspended until violations are corrected." But Bob Morrison was no longer interested in hearing about safety requirements or compliance deadlines, having concluded that any enforcement actions taken against Morrison Industries were evidence of personal vendettas rather than legitimate building management. "We're not making any modifications to our booth," Bob declared with the kind of absolute authority that brooked no further discussion. Morrison Industries will not be manipulated by building owners who have personal grievances against our family. Carlos's expression reflected the professional frustration of someone trying to enforce legitimate safety requirements against people who viewed compliance as optional, based on their personal relationships with property owners. "Mr. Morrison, building safety codes aren't negotiable," Carlos said with the firmness required to manage difficult exhibitors. "Your booth operations will remain suspended until violations are corrected, regardless of ownership structure or family relationships." Patricia Morrison stood up from the conference table with the dignity of someone who'd reached the limits of tolerating what she viewed as deliberate humiliation. "Come on, Bob," Patricia said, gathering her purse with decisive movements. "We don't need to subject ourselves to any more manipulation from people who've been deceiving us about their motives from the beginning." Bob Morrison rose to follow his wife, his movement signaling that Morrison Industries was choosing confrontation over compliance, family loyalty over business pragmatism. Morrison Industries will be filing complaints with Expo Management and the Better Business Bureau about the harassment we've received from building management, Bob announced as he prepared to leave the conference room. "This kind of targeted enforcement is exactly what's wrong with American business." Kevin and Amanda Morrison followed Bob and Patricia toward the conference room exit, their departure representing Morrison Industries' rejection of safety compliance in favor of conspiracy theories about deliberate targeting. Mark Morrison remained seated at the conference table, his expression reflecting the agony of being torn between loyalty to his family and recognition that their response to legitimate safety requirements was both unreasonable and professionally damaging. "Mark," Patricia called from the doorway, her voice carrying the authority of someone demanding a choice between family loyalty and personal relationships. "Are you coming with us, or are you staying here with the people who've been manipulating our family business?" The ultimatum that Patricia delivered was designed to force Mark into choosing between supporting his family's interpretation of events or defending his wife's concealed business activities. Mark looked at me with an expression that combined hurt, confusion, and desperate hope that I could somehow explain my actions in ways that would make sense of the chaos that had erupted around our marriage. "Lisa, is there anything else you haven't told me?" Mark asked, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who discovered that his understanding of his own life had been fundamentally incomplete. The question was fair and devastating, representing Mark's recognition that my concealment of convention center ownership might be only one example of hidden information that could affect our relationship and his family's business interests. "There's nothing else that affects Morrison Industries," I said honestly, though I realized that my answer didn't address the broader question of trust and transparency that Mark was really asking about. Patricia Morrison's voice carried from the hallway outside the conference room, her impatience evident as she waited for Mark to choose between family solidarity and personal loyalty. "Mark, we're leaving now," Patricia announced. "Morrison Industries has better things to do than negotiate with people who've been lying to us about their business relationships." Mark stood up slowly from the conference table, his movement suggesting that he'd made the choice that family dynamics had made inevitable. "I have to go with them," Mark said quietly, his words representing not just departure from the conference room, but recognition that our marriage had been fundamentally damaged by revelations that neither of us had been prepared to handle. As the Morrison family left the conference room to return to their non-compliant booth operations, Carlos Mendoza and I remained alone with the compliance documentation that would determine whether Morrison Industries could continue their trade show participation. "I'm sorry about how that went," Carlos said after the family's departure, his voice carrying genuine regret about the personal conflicts that had emerged from routine safety enforcement. "It's not your fault," I replied, recognizing that Carlos had been caught between his professional obligations and personal loyalty to someone who'd helped him during a family crisis. "What happens now?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Carlos consulted his compliance checklist with the methodical precision that had made him so effective at managing complex event logistics. "Morrison Industries has 24 hours to correct the safety violations or cease booth operations," Carlos said matter-of-factly. "Building codes don't change based on family relationships or ownership structure." As I prepared to leave the conference room where my marriage had effectively ended and my relationship with Mark's family had been permanently destroyed, I reflected on the irony that 6 years of contributing to Morrison Industries' success without appropriate recognition had culminated in a moment where my greatest business achievement had been transformed into evidence of predatory manipulation. The Morrison family had finally learned exactly who they'd been underestimating, but their discovery had come in circumstances that made reconciliation impossible and vindication hollow. Tomorrow would bring the consequences of their choice to prioritize family solidarity over business compliance, while I would begin the process of rebuilding a life that no longer included the people I'd spent 6 years trying to help succeed. The silence in our Highland home that evening was different from the comfortable quiet that Mark and I had shared during 6 years of marriage. This was the heavy, expectant silence that follows earthquakes, when everyone is waiting to discover what structures have survived and what foundations have been irreparably damaged. Morrison Industries chose defiance over compliance, shutting down their booth rather than addressing the safety violations. Bob Morrison held a press conference, positioning their family as victims of regulatory harassment rather than exhibitors who'd failed to meet legitimate building codes. The local media coverage was brief and unflattering, with industry publications questioning exhibitors who prioritized personal grievances over professional obligations. The business consequences were swift and devastating. 3 major clients canceled contracts, citing concerns about vendor reliability. Rocky Mountain Equipment captured several of Morrison Industries' former accounts by emphasizing their commitment to professional standards. Within months, the company that had dismissed my expertise was struggling with the kind of distressed business situation that Chen Walsh Properties specialized in rehabilitating. Mark and I divorced quietly, recognizing that our marriage couldn't survive family dynamics that viewed my success as evidence of predatory intent. I kept Chen Walsh Properties and continued building what became a regional leader in commercial real estate development. 2 years later, I founded Colorado Women in Business, creating the supportive community I'd never found within Morrison Industries. Our annual conference now attracts 300 female entrepreneurs to the Westfield Convention Center, celebrating success through collaboration rather than competition. Jennifer Walsh and I had grown our portfolio to over $150 million, transforming distressed properties into profitable enterprises while creating jobs and revitalizing neighborhoods. The expertise that Morrison Industries had dismissed as threatening was now generating substantial returns for investors who valued analytical capabilities over family loyalty. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd achieved authentic success by building relationships with people who understood my value, while those who'd called me a business vulture struggled with consequences of their own choices. Morrison Industries eventually recovered, but never regained their former prominence in the industry. Sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated isn't revenge or confrontation. Sometimes it's simply building something magnificent, while others argue about who deserves credit for past achievements. The quiet woman in the room, the one everyone overlooks, isn't always planning destruction. Sometimes she's planning her own transformation, creating value through expertise that's finally appreciated rather than viewed with suspicion, proving that the greatest victory is refusing to stay small for people who need you diminished, to feel secure about their own limitations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.